and it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer really standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Please remember to visit the website podcastufo.com for past episodes, blogs, and forums. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello, and welcome to the show. And we have a humdinger of a show for you tonight. First of all, we'll be coming up with Alejandro Rojas with UFO updates. Then we have about a 10-minute or so pre-recorded clip with Greg Coolidge and Kirk Ward. And they want to talk about their new pilot called Skyward. It's really interesting. It's a kid's show, but it involves a UFO podcast. And it was partially inspired by the show. They got in touch with me about that. So our guest this evening is via phone. I'm very excited about him. I heard him on Alejandro's show. He's great. It's Richard Thieme, and he was part of a UFO history group that spent 5 years writing a book called UFOs. UFOs Government? No. Well, I'm sorry. Wow. UFO History Group, which spent 5 years, UFOs and Government. Sorry about that. A historical inquiry on top of 50 years of research, gathering documents from the government and elsewhere. It should be a fascinating guest. I'm really excited about that. So a couple of quick announcements. Remember, if you become a member, subscriber for only $2 or more per month, you get not only the full shows and archives, but you also get the Everything Else show in the podcast feed. And this week's show was really good. It was about the Dyatlov Pass incident, very fascinating case. And I spoke with a girl named Teddy, and she has a #2 website. If you search the Dyatlov Pass incident, her website comes up #2. Very interesting. Mountaineer and explorer, and has a really good insight on what possibly happened. Also, I will be up at the Shag Harbor 50th anniversary. I'm going to be recording a live show on YouTube as well with Jordan Bonaparte. That's on September 30th of this month. And that will also be on the live feed as well. So if you want to tune in live, that information will be up on our website during the week. If you can't help us out, you can always listen to the whole show for free at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Wednesdays at podcastufo.com or on YouTube. You can also listen for free on the Dark Matter Digital Network Thursday nights 10 p.m. till midnight, and on Outworld Fleet Radio on Saturday nights at 6 p.m. That's it for me. Alejandro, what's going on? How are you?
Oh, I'm doing good.
Good. You had an exciting time out there at Devil's Tower. So
that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear about that.
It was gorgeous out there. The tower is so strange. It's one of those things, just like lots of national monuments, where you have to see it, where pictures don't do it justice. It's just such an interesting place. So it was a lot of fun. The hosts were great. The host, Bob Olson, owns the Best Western there, and then Lori Tucker is someone who lives in the area and put together this group to sponsor this whole event. And she's into UFOs and stuff. And then there was, Richard, who is in charge of Wyoming MUFON. And then Mark D'Antonio. There was Debbie Ziegelmeyer and Chuck Zukowski. And our good buddy Mark D'Antonio and Travis Walton all were out there. In fact, we visited the monument with Travis and did the walk around, and that was a lot of fun. So really cool. And the Sun was there, which is one of these UK tabloids, and you and I complain about these UK tabloids so much all the time, including the Sun. But the writer has been writing a story about the different talks every day this week. So today she wrote about Travis. Yesterday was a really good one. She wrote about Mark D'Antonio, which with a story that he shares amongst people but doesn't really share publicly so much. But now this story is public, which is really cool, and he's happy about that. Which is essentially when he was on a sub, because he works with the Navy building models and stuff, and he was on a sub when they right next to the sonar guy when they were tracking something moving very fast.
Yeah,
and
like 200 knots or something crazy.
Yeah, something crazy. So, and they called it a fast mover. And he said later on he asked one of the guys in the Navy about the fast mover program, and he said, "Don't ask about that again."
That's right.
And it was kind of funny because when he asked the CEO or the CO on the sub, hey, what was that? The CO said, "Are you having a good time on the ship?" And Mark said, "Yeah, this has been great." He said, "Well, let's just keep it that way." So another indication that, sorry, we're not talking about it. So, yeah, that was really good stuff. So she's going to have me in a story, I think, tomorrow or the next day, because my talk was about I did two talks, one of them about Steven Spielberg and then one of them about strange alien cases. And if you've seen this talk, you know one of my cases is about Lord Mountbatten. And Mountbatten is important because he is the uncle of Prince Philip, the husband of Queen Elizabeth. And Prince Philip was really he saw Lord Mountbatten as his father figure through life, and Mountbatten was very important. He was admiral of the fleet. He was the last viceroy of India. So if you watch Gandhi, he's portrayed in that, an extremely important person. But he was also very much into UFOs, and he believed a UFO landed on his property. So you'll be able to read more about that in that story. But a story I wrote about was with Lee Spiegel, and if you heard my interview with him, you'll know some about it. But this is Spiegel essentially talking about how when he was putting together, hopefully you've had him on talking about this, but the United Nations.
Oh, yeah.
Lee Spiegel was behind, getting the United Nations to do this AV presentation to try to get them to do something about UFOs. And Spielberg actually invited him and Hynek and Vallée to offer his help. So I wrote a story about that. I'm going to put it on the Huffington Post this week also, and I do have a video that I played at my talk that I'll be putting up on YouTube of Lee going over that. So that's really cool. And today, speaking of UFO stuff, today I wrote a story. This is a great story if you haven't heard it, and maybe you've heard this one. So Nick Pope, who worked for the Ministry of Defense UFO desk, when he showed up to work in 1991, there was a poster of a UFO. He said it was this large diamond-shaped metallic object with a jet in the background. So this amazing picture. And I guess he said it's the most spectacular UFO photo he's ever seen. And it was hanging up there on the wall, but eventually it got taken down and it disappeared. And the story behind this is really interesting because it's a real picture. These witnesses took this picture in like 1990 and in the Scotland area. And when he asked, what is this picture? They explained the whole situation. They said, we think it's real. We think it's really, some 80-foot in diameter craft that was seen, and they don't know what it is. They didn't believe it was the Americans. They didn't believe it belonged to the British. So his boss even said it must then belong to and pointed up. So really interesting case. And what's really cool too is that UK's Channel 5 worked with Nick to recreate this poster. And so it's an incredible image. So I posted that today. So yeah, those are some of the stories out there going on. Otherwise, another really good story today was in the Herald Sun from Australia because James Fox has been out there working on his latest documentary. Lee Spiegel is helping him actually write the script, but James Fox is out there interviewing people about this Westall UFO case, this famous Australian case that he's going to include in his documentary.
Oh, I'm glad he's including that one. It's a real great one. Well, thanks so much, Alejandro, and we'll see you next week, right?
All right. Yep. We'll talk to you next week.
All right. Have a good one. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
See ya.
Bye. All right, everyone. So I'm going to play this clip right now. Hang in there. All right, so I am pre-recording this bit right here, and I am on the line with a couple great guys, Greg Coolidge and Kirk Ward. Now, they have a kids series pilot. It's now on Amazon, and it's called Skyward, and I recommend you check it out. It's a lot of fun. We're going to be talking about that. I'm going to read you a quick synopsis of what it is. 3 friends host a secret underground podcast exploring paranormal sightings in their tiny town of Wildwood, Oregon. Together, Piper, Curtis, and Ira try to prove the existence of aliens and can't help but become personally involved with the cases of people who call in their show. So, Kirk and Greg, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us, Martin. Thank you.
Yeah, and so why don't, Kirk, why don't you tell us a little bit how you got inspired to do this and how it all came about?
Well, Greg and I have been working together for years and as a writing team, and we always, when I first met Greg, he would share little UFO things with me, like send me stuff, and I was like, oh, wow, he's into this too, so we would send each other different things about sightings, and we just found it fascinating. And I think, speaking for the both of us, we're not really big like sci-fi buffs, but there's always been something about, that we bonded about the universe and that we're not alone and there has to be something out there. And we'd always had talked about doing a show, with aliens and, like Close Encounters in E.T. and the Goonies, like that type of tone. And we batted around some ideas. And then when my daughter was born, I was reading this article on UFO radio shows in the LA Times. I remember because I was up around the clock. I was rocking her in this chair, and I read this article about UFO radio shows, AM radio shows around the country. And like I said to you earlier, Martin, we were fans of Coast to Coast and Art Bell. So I brought this article in, and we have a big idea board in our office at Sunset Tower Studios, and we always, when our eyes pop, like I pitched this thing to Greg, and he's like, yes. And that's kind of what you're looking for in a partnership, a writing partnership, is the other person sparking to it. Mm-hmm. And so it was kind of on our board for quite some time, and we batted around different ideas. And, originally it was going to be more of like a Midnight Caller meets X-Files. And we started to really develop that. And it never really kind of just didn't ever really crack. But we always kept coming back to it. And then one day Greg said, I got it. And usually when he says, I got it, and he snaps his fingers, I got it. He's like, what if we make this more of kids and a podcast? And then it was like a whole new explosion. We started like, oh, that's it. And we kind of had another similar idea about kids, this other kind of idea, the similar tone, and we kind of took a lot of that. And I remember the day when it all kind of came together, because it's one of those things that like within 45, 50 minutes, you're like, yep, this is it, this is it, this is it. So it was really cool. And then we'd met our friend Sabrina Wind, producer on the show. She, you'd know her from Reba, Desperate Housewives, Devious Maids. And she was going, we'd met her, and we were like, hey, we should find a project together. And she heard the logline for this and was like, oh, man, this is incredible. And she teamed us up with Jonathan Judge, who is a big kids director. And we had a meeting with him, and he immediately responded to it. And then we went out as a team, and I think we went to just Amazon and Nickelodeon. And Greg, correct me if I'm wrong. I think we just went to those two places, and they both wanted it. We ultimately went with, that's right, and Disney. See,
and Disney wanted it as well, but they were like, we don't do this kind of stuff.
Oh, really?
Right.
Wow.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And then we
wanted to keep it very grounded. We wanted it to be very Spielbergian. We wanted it to feel very real, and feel like, that adults and kids would enjoy it equally. And so the tone of it is very hard to hit. And that's why Disney said, we don't do that kind of stuff we do it for live action for our feature films, but not for our television station. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead, Kirk.
No, that's exactly right. And that's why we ended up going with, like Greg was saying, with Amazon, because they allowed us, to have the tone that we wanted, which is exactly that. It's real, it's grounded, it has heart. There's father and daughter scenes are real, and then there's the comedic element. The comedic elements are still grounded, but come out of the story and come out of kind of the fantasy of, a children's story. So, yeah, that was kind of basically how it all came together. There's a lot more and a longer timeline. But in general, yeah.
Yeah, and now a quick question. You said you listened to the podcast, my podcast. Is that something you did before you thought of this, or was this all in your research?
It was, I mean, we've always been listening to stuff, but it was, when we were developing the show, there was a couple podcasts and a couple of articles and stuff we were reading, and we just liked how your show was so grounded. Like, we were like, yes. If she had a podcast, like we're not going to show a lot of the podcast in the series, because that's not super exciting. But we were like, to show the moments of when she's actually communicating with people that are calling in, we wanted to make it grounded and make it conversational and real, because a lot of them we found, just too conspiracy for us, where we really like what we like about you and your podcast, Martin, is you have real conversations about finding the truth, and it becomes like a really just honest, open dialogue about what's out there and what are the possibilities. So
yeah, that's great.
And your live stuff too. I like the live show. I've seen it a couple times.
Oh yeah, that's
the live stream.
As far as I think it's great that you have the resident skeptic, Curtis. Yeah, he's really funny. And so whose idea was it to have the gumball machine alien, with all the eyeballs? It's kind of like a gumball machine, don't you think?
Yeah. I mean, Greg, you could take this one. I mean, it's always a collaboration, but I have to say, I think Greg...
It was mine. No, I'm kidding.
No, I think the eyeballs were... I think the eyeballs were your idea, because I can remember you saying maybe they go out like scouts. So, yeah.
Right. Well, yeah, we just wanted to make it a little bit different than things that you've seen before and stuff that you would sort of predict in your mind. And we thought that, like an eyeball amongst eyeballs with hundreds of be sent out into the city to be looking for something in particular.
Yeah.
No, and we have some ideas about what that particular eyeball may or may not be attached to later in the series.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It sort of leaves off at the end like a cliffhanger a little bit. So for sure that, the eyeballs, well, I don't want to do any spoiler because I do want some people to watch this, of course. But at the end, it kind of leaves you hanging where, there could be some left behind, well, I'll say it that way.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Definitely.
Yeah, and we also wanted, with the creation of we collaborated with Todd Tucker, and Greg, forgive me. See, I always forget everything. What's the name of Todd's studio? Do you remember? Industrial Light Magic?
Yeah, really.
No.
I can find out.
Anyways, we collaborated with Todd Tucker, who's an amazing puppeteer, makes creatures. He did the Jim Caviezel full body for Passion of the Christ. And, we really wanted this. We labored over this creature for a long time because we wanted it to, look like something unique, that moved unique, that had a specific mission when it came here. Well, a lot of times when we watch sci-fi stuff and you see the creatures, we feel that like, wow, people just get carried away and in all the things all the possibilities that the creature can do and how big they are and all this stuff. We're like, we wanted to keep it really simple.
Wanted it to be scary, but not like I'm going to die any second scary.
Right.
because of the age range, we have to go from like 6 years old all the way to 60 years old. So it has to play for like a much, much bigger group. Illusion Industries. That's the name of it.
That's it. Illusion Industries.
Yeah.
Really great guy, and built us the creature. I mean, we came in with a bunch of sketches and ideas. He drew it up, and our production designer, Richard Hoover, who is an amazing guy, he did the original Twin Peaks Tony Award winner. Just incredible guy, and he had input as well, and we honed it down to that. And then the eyeballs spinning around in the head, that was supposed to be like a beehive. So yeah, it was he was a fun one to create for sure.
Yeah, I bet. Now it looks to me like it's a pretty hefty budget you're working with there. I mean, it's a very, very nice production, and great actors and all. I think that you're pretty serious, and I do want to tell the listener, check it out. And one of the things I thought that Curtis said was pretty funny, I wanted to repeat on this. He said, we've been doing this podcast for over a year and still have not found proof aliens exist. I love that. I've been doing it for 6 years, and I agree.
Well, to an 11-year-old, a year is 6 years.
That's right.
Right. So
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. Can you tell the listeners how they would actually catch this, and also leave a review, right?
please,
Yeah, it's called Skyward. If you go to Amazon.com/TV pilots, is that it, Greg? Do you notice I always ask Greg?
I think you can just type in Skyward into your Amazon, whether you have Prime or not. You can just type the word Skyward in, and it will come up.
Right.
And we ask that you watch it, and give it a a review. And there's 5 stars to choose from. We've found that picking the 5th star when giving it 5 stars is the easiest because it's right at the end. So a 5-star review.
Yeah.
And then some nice comments. Little things like it's a show for the entire family, and then share it between you and 3,478 of your friends on social media.
There you go.
It's not that bad.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, guys. Well, thanks so much, and I wish you all the luck in the world. I really hope that it gets picked up, and I know how pilots can be, and I hope it gets picked up. You really put a lot of work into it. Take care, guys.
Well, listen.
Thanks so much.
Martin,
Thank you, Martin. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us.
You bet. All right. We'll be right back with our guest. All right, we're dialing. I'm not sure what's happening. Here it is. Hey, Richard.
Hey.
Hi.
Yes, hi.
Richard Thieme, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. We're on now?
Yes, we are. Yes, we are.
Okay, then I'll watch what I say.
Not like earlier.
Yeah, right.
I heard you on Alejandro's show, and I thought it was fantastic. I love when people are really grounded, and that's what I think about you and your work. But you have quite a background. You've also been involved in the technology world. Do you want to talk about your background and how things morphed into your interest in UFOs, or had you always had that interest?
Well, I guess as a young person's kid, we growing up as I did, born in '44. There was a lot of exciting stuff in the media then. When you say the media, it's very different then. Mm-hmm. It was very limited. But I remember reading a book by Willie Ray on space stations, and it seemed very, very exotic and very futuristic, as well as getting satellites up and so on. So the world was expanding in terms of space, and UFO reports were around. And I think it's almost impossible, certainly it was for me, to just ignore them and not be interested in them. So I read a bunch of books, and that was about it. I read what I could. But in 1978, I was an Episcopal clergyman then, and I was in my first parish, a small parish on the edge of Hill Air Force Base in Clearfield, Utah. And a member of the parish was a fighter pilot, a guy with the real right stuff, heavily decorated pilot. And I was talking to him alone in the church basement one day, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind was in the movie theaters then. That was, 40 years ago. And I mentioned to him that I had read people like Alan Hynek or Jacques Vallée. And I said, what I read is that you guys chase these things in your fastest fighters and you can't catch them. What's the story? And what I remember is that he looked perplexed. He looked serious. He was a pretty cocky guy. You know, he'd walk into a room with a Stetson and a cigar and a flak jacket, and people would kind of gather around him. He had that kind of authority. But he didn't look that way then. And he said, well, that's right. He said, we chase them and we can't catch them. So that was the moment I experienced what you'd call a contextual shift. And I think that's true for a lot of us, that somebody we knew and knew well, and whose credibility was unimpeachable, and whose authenticity and honesty was impeccable, told me that, yes, this is real. So it shifted from being fun and of general interest and isn't this cool to, wow, what's behind this? What is this? And how can I find out as much as possible about it? Now, I was a clergyman then. I was an Episcopal clergyman for 16 years. And I never failed to use the opportunity, and there were a number of them, during confidential conversations when people intimated something that made me think they might know something about it or had an experience, to ask about it. And so I did a lot of direct, I don't want to call it interrogation, but direct inquiry of what people's experience was over time. And as I did that, I what I call escalated my game. That is, I read the best people. I realized there was really a lot of nonsense, misinformation, disinformation about this subject for a variety of reasons. I tried to escalate my game so that I was engaged with only the best people. And as I did that, you kind of leapfrog up the ladder. A lot of the people who were well known and who were trying to make a living about this, writing books and so on, were not necessarily those people. Now that trajectory, which included, as I left the ministry to speak and write full time 24 years ago, and it was about, above all, the impact of technology on society, on people, on the human and the machine. What was this revolution we're going through going to do to identity, and so on? Well, that led me to doing a lot of speaking at security conferences and some engagement with people who are in the intelligence community. I'm not a, I don't belong to it. I just traded on the habits and character that developed during my ministry years to engage with people one-on-one in confidential conversations. And so in those contexts, more and more came to me, and I'm a pretty good synthetic thinker in terms of integrating disparate inputs, distinguishing what I know from what I know I don't know, and integrating it and articulating a synthesis. And then I was very fortunate around, 2007, to be invited by, I was talking to Jan Aldrich, and he mentioned this group that was going to get together in Texas to plan to write some serious white papers about the subject, for the reason, in part, to demonstrate to the world that it was a serious subject worthy of serious scholarly pursuit. And when we met, what we concluded was that nothing short of a book would work. Now, there had been a great deal of research done prior to then. We had a tremendous number of clippings and files, Mike Swords, the professor of natural science at Western Michigan University, and Robert Powell, who had headed up the chemistry department at AMD, the chip manufacturer, were the two leaders of the team, but there were people like Barry Greenwood, who wrote Clear Intent, and Jan Aldrich of Project 1947, who had been gathering documents and studying them with some real discretion and finesse and subtlety for decades. I would say literally half a century. And we all contributed. My part, I'm always quick to say I had a small part, but a part that for me was instrumental in accessing and engaging with all of the material that over the 5 years it took to write that book came our way. And then there were other writers who did chapters on other countries, and a great guy named Steve Purcell, who did the thankless task of getting permissions and not including photographs for which we could not get permissions. And Mike has been my mentor, but I've engaged with these other people and paid close attention. I had a pretty good mind. I had taught English literature at the University of Illinois after getting a bachelor's at Northwestern and a master's at the University of Chicago. And then I had another 3-year master's when I prepared for the ministry. And I engaged with people also in a lot of interviews. I used the structure of MUFON in Wisconsin to interview people specifically and document what their experiences were. And some of those were astonishing, really. The end result of all that, now 1978, it's a lot of years, 40 years of engaging with this subject by engaging with the very best minds and students of the subject that I could find, and sitting at their feet and letting them teach me. I mentioned Mike. He is a terrific teacher. I mean, as a teacher, he was a terrific science teacher at Western Michigan University, and he was willing to give me very generously of his time. And once we met for a weekend, and he invited me to ask whatever questions I wanted to. This was the CUFOS headquarters in Chicago, and others joined that meeting, including Mark Rodiger popped in and out, and the Murphys from Michigan at that time, and a few others. And it was kind of a private seminar for 48 hours. Now, at that point, I had learned everything I could through the methodologies I described, but that was where I took all of the questions that it had raised, because I thought, what am I missing? And what turns out when you do it that way is, in terms of what's public, what's out here, in terms of the data, you're not missing that much. You may not be missing that much. We know a lot of the data, and that's what the book to which I referred is called UFOs and Government, A Historical Inquiry. It's published by Anomalist Books, and it's a terrific book. It's 600 pages long. It's got about 1,000 footnotes, and every single footnote points to a government document or other primary source. And so when it came time to review the book for Choice is the name of the journal which reviews books for university libraries, they said, unlike the dreary material in ufology, this one stands out and belongs in every university library.
Unreal.
And
wow.
Yeah, and it's in at least 65, last time I looked, university libraries. And it said that because that data is bulletproof. It's all, as I say, government sources or primary sources, which over half a century these tireless, obsessive researchers had managed to gather, and which we all parsed and pruned. But Mike had the synthesis based on the foundational work that had been done before. And now we're in the process of scoping out a second book on the phenomena itself and making all of these thousands, tens of thousands of files accessible to serious scholars. loading them into a website online. It's not available to the public. You can't just go there. But for serious scholars, we want the material to be available, and that's because we are getting along in age, all the people on this team, and we've seen what's happened. I mean, there have been some very sad stories of terrific people like Richard Hall, who sold his entire collection of material, the great author of UFO evidence, to someone who now hides it away and won't let anyone have access to it.
Yeah.
So we want to do the very best we can to make sure that the data is available, because the reasons it's in all those academic libraries is because the data is bulletproof. And what we discuss in that book is the narrative about the government and how it responded in light of serious and genuine national security concerns to the phenomena, roughly from the 40s to the 80s. And so we don't speculate. We don't say to people when they say, well, what do you think? People say to me, oh, you wrote a book about aliens. And I say, no. The word aliens, I think, does not occur in the book. UFOs occurs in the book a lot because we show how seriously the government took UFOs. The documentation in the 40s and 50s, as we trace it, shows they knew this was something really important. And there have been at least two major prongs, one of which is to, from the 50s on, damp down enthusiasm and excitement among the public by denying and by ridiculing and by debunking and by giving explanations. But on the other hand, we know that's where it was formulated at the Robinson Panel. We know the Robinson Panel didn't formulate policy for the whole government, but it looks as if the government did, in fact, follow the broad contours, which had those two prongs: debunk it, calm people down, but at the same time do research, because they described the aerodynamic qualities of this technology. They knew it wasn't ours, and you're probably familiar with the estimate of the situation, which concluded that it was one of three things, right? Russian, American, or extraterrestrial. And they did their research and their homework and concluded that it wasn't, as the Air Force concluded it wasn't Russian and it wasn't ours, it wasn't a secret project. So that left just one. Now what's happened since then, it's kind of interesting, is we only had that one category. Don't forget, we were just getting into space then. When was Sputnik, 56? We didn't even know if satellites would work. And when we went to the moon the next decade, I remember very real fears that the rockets and astronauts would sink in moon dust and suffocate to death. We literally forget what we didn't know, which was almost everything. Now we're used to having Hubble images and X-ray telescope images and radio telescope images and or renderings, and we've gone all through the solar system, robotically, telerobotically, and explored our own solar system, the extraordinary scientific work as well as the popular availability of the close-ups of our neighborhood. Well, that hadn't happened then. So part of this story is how we have expanded our own understanding, and physics has expanded or developed other theories as well. So today, people say, they don't just say extraterrestrial as one hypothesis. They say maybe this is time travel. Maybe we don't know where they come from. Maybe it's a question of when, because at the speeds that seem likely, relativity comes into play, and people are not going to come back at the same age at which they left. Maybe this is from the future, literally, by virtue of the speed of the technology which alters time in relationship to our time. Or maybe there is a multiverse. Maybe there are multiple dimensions, or baby universes that bud off. Those concepts weren't very thinkable then.
Right.
So that's why the only one people came up with was extraterrestrial.
Right.
But now it's pretty common for people to say, I think it's common, maybe it's the people I hang around with, the universe is in all likelihood teeming with life, that where life can happen, it will happen. we have now managed to say there are billions of stars in this galaxy and billions of galaxies in the visible part of the universe that we can access. And it is impossible to stand before that network of galaxies without awe and without not just suspecting, but knowing that we're not so hot. We're pretty recent as a species, right? And I'm looking at electric lights here in my study, and those 150 years old electric lights. I mean, we're brand new on the on the technology plane, and anyone else who evolved sentient intelligence over thousands of years before, or hundreds of years before, would know things we don't know how to even imagine or guess or say. And my understanding is that whatever research has been done on these vehicles, we still can't make them do that. We don't know how to do what we've observed them doing, but we have come a long way in experiments toward doing those things. And people say you can't get here from there, it's too far, but already we have exotic propulsion systems under consideration that would remarkably shorten the time it takes to get to the next star system.
I think that's very close-minded when I hear that statement, that you just can't get we don't have the energy, because there's things in physics that we haven't discovered yet, or like you said, we're working on. Now, you don't seem like the type of person that would guess on something, but I'm going to ask you anyway. If you had to guess if the government actually knew what the things were flying around in the sky, what would you guess?
You're asking if I thought the government knew what they were, or the identity of the animating intelligence?
If you had to lay a bet down, would you bet that the government knew what was going on, or would you think they're just as puzzled as everyone else?
I think they're just as puzzled as everyone else about some things, but I think they know a number of things. I mean, don't forget, the Air Force Academy in the 1970s had a textbook for the cadets at the relatively new Air Force Academy, and I believe it was the last chapter of that thick book was on anomalies, and that focused on UFO phenomena. And about half the chapter was devoted to some pretty good cases by someone who was familiar with them, and the other half was speculation. And in that speculative section, the statement was made, the uncorrelated data suggests that 4 different civilizations were visiting the Earth. Now that's a pretty big statement. That finally got out and was publicized, and where, of course, was it publicized? In the National Enquirer, which meant that no one would ever take the story seriously. But the book was retracted, and that chapter was retracted and pulped, and a new chapter in the next edition said nothing like that and didn't have any case studies at all. So sometimes one of the ways you do research is to look at different branches of government and different documents to see what somebody said that they didn't know was not something they shouldn't say because they weren't read into a classified category such that they would know that what they were saying was classified. So you might look at the State Department or Department of Justice or whatever, and that's what the researchers do. I mean, you just comb through everything to see what we can learn, and that's one of the things we learned, that in the 1970s the statement was made by the author of that chapter that the best guess was 4 different civilizations. Now, that does strongly imply, even though we don't understand the physics of it or the propulsion and so on, extraterrestrial. Because these are not Earth civilizations. They're not living under the poles. They're not living in the mountains. They're not a clandestine cadre of tall whites or small grays in cahoots with our government. Those are stories. And the question you always ask about any narrative is, where's the data? Where's the documentation? And especially in the Internet era, people seem to be prone to believe almost anything. When I give speeches, I have people sometimes ask me, do I believe we have rovers on Mars? Or do I think we really went to the moon? And I look at these intelligent people asking these questions, and it scares me, and it boggles the mind to see that the consensus of understanding of what's real has so shredded that somebody could ask that question in seriousness.
Yeah. Why do you suppose that is? It's just all the information and false information coming out? With the internet, just so much?
Well, I think in part we hoisted ourselves on our own petard, is the saying, when people don't know what a petard is or how to hoist yourself. But what it means is the responsibility for the conditions. They began after World War II, when the classification schemes and secrecy from World War II, which was appropriate, carried over into the Cold War, and they've never stopped. So we call it the national security state, and that's exactly what it is. And what it means is, I do a talk called Fiction is the Only Way to Tell the Truth. I was looking at what somebody did with it on YouTube. A lot of my talks are on YouTube. You just plug my name in and up they come. And some of the things I showed there were that the practice of disinformation rendered it almost impossible for the normal human being to know what was real. There's misinformation, there's disinformation, and now, what the Russian scandal has revealed is that you don't have to be Russian in order to have trolls. They have lots of trolls, and they comb the internet, and they create false stories, and they create false narratives after doing research on which kinds of people with what kinds of mentality are likely to believe the stories they create. And so I coined the phrase a long time ago of real birds in digital cages, that you create a digital structure in which people put themselves, and then you move the cage, and then you don't have to move the individual inside. They just come along with the narrative. And so it's resulted in a populace. First of all, critical thinking is kind of on the wane. A lot of people don't know how to do it, and education for it is not as strong as it used to be. And so a lot of people don't know how to know. I mean, it's questions of epistemology. How do you know what you know? And how do you document it? How do you verify it? A lot of people are just happy to repeat what's been repeated a million times, and often they don't know it's 1,000 websites directed and orchestrated by a single person or a single government entity. And we did plenty of that too. So in that environment, to get at the truth is very difficult, and it does mean people are going to be prone to believing almost anything, because some of the things we uncover are literally beyond belief. You can't believe people did that, but they did.
Wow. Someone asked right off the bat, of course, talk about a million times, the Roswell topic. There was never any type of government documents that ever mentioned Roswell except in the 1990s, right?
I'm not familiar with much on Roswell from the government, and what there isn't conclusive in terms of any narrative. When they did that silly story about crash test dummies, at a time when crash test dummies hadn't even been used,
right?
It's like they're saying we're going to lie to you, and you know we're lying, but it's a way of telling you that whatever the truth is, we're not going to tell you, and you're not going to find it out. And that's the situation. We don't talk about Roswell in our book very much because there's no documentation for it. It's kind of an outlier. Most people are very familiar with the cottage industry called Roswell that's been built out of books and documentaries and movies, and you see enough of those. It's kind of like the gray on the cover of Communion. Once that's in the imagination, that's what grays look like. But we don't know. So the Roswell narrative has been fraught from the beginning with all sorts of assertions that over time have been revealed to be untrue. Witnesses who were not witnesses at all. people telling stories who were revealed to
Yeah.
telling stories. And if there's some who seem credible in terms of the material, the remarkable material, and there's the fun story about Wright Pat and the Battelle Institute next door working on a new substance which had those properties of recoverability and so on. But that's correlation, not causation. We don't know. We've all heard lots of stories about recovery of bodies, but every time there's an image of a body, like the famous autopsy video, it's bogus. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't take much to make a bogus story. It doesn't take much to insert a narrative into the mind and eager hands of what the intelligence community calls useful idiots. So we have a lot of documented instances, like the aviary, once upon a time, and the alien who loves strawberry ice cream.
Right.
It doesn't take that much, and if you want to do something seriously to throw the wagon off the tracks, the resources which military and intelligence and government people have are extraordinary. And these are, they make mistakes and sometimes bumble things, but these are professionals, and a lot of the time they know what they're doing. And when it's the more important it is, the more critical the knowledge is, the more ardor and money is going to be spent to make sure that nobody finds out, because it is understood in terms of national security issues, and those go to the highest levels that they can. So, do I think there are people inside what we call government? It's probably not a government structure. It's off the books, mm-hmm. which is the way you handle anything if you don't want it on the books, and it would include corporate and military and perhaps government as well. But it wouldn't be a huge group, wouldn't be a huge cadre, and it would be a group of absolutely trusted individuals who trust one another and who now, several generations down the line, can recruit others from the next generation on the basis of knowing them. And it's the way the agencies now people are lined up trying to go to the agencies after 9/11. But once upon a time, a lot of the different agencies had kind of proprietary campuses which they oversaw as sources of recruitment. And in the senior year, a student might be called in to the office of a favored professor who suddenly says, I have some ideas for you about where you might want to go for work. And one of the signs that is happening campus-wide is when you have a lot of very bright people who you never hear from again. They graduate and they go on, and you don't know. You can look at their finances, and very often they received an infusion of cash, say in the 70s, when they were kind of reeling, needed money, and the money came in. And there are other hallmarks you can use to kind of identify what those campuses were, where people could be observed in social, academic, and a variety of academic. It's not just a narrow academic training. And then they go on into dark work. So we're not going to get there. We're not going to get to them. And I've learned over time that when people approach me and suggest to me that they have some revelation they want to give me and they hope I'll share it from the platform, the red flags just start flying at that point.
Yeah, it's kind of like there's a number of deathbed confessions that are on YouTube that you almost can kind of think along those lines, similar.
Yeah.
It's awful hard to know when you're trying to find out more about the subject to have the right type of filter. And
right.
And what would you suggest to, like, say, one of the listeners out there that's fascinated by the topic? How would you go about that? I mean, there's so, like you said, there's so much disinformation and misinformation, and now the British tabloids, get involved with stories and with half truths, and so there's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of jumble out there.
That's right. And the tabloids, I mean, let me just start with that, because the story of the National Enquirer is very interesting. It's not conclusive proof, but it's highly suggestive. The National Enquirer began in 1953, and Gene Pope, or Generoso, his Italian name, Pope, who began it, in 1952, what he was doing was psychological operations for the CIA.
Right, yeah.
And he left the agency to start the newspaper, which did not make money for a number of years. And hundreds of thousands of dollars came to him every year to keep it afloat. And a lot of it transited through Frank Costello, the head of the mafia in New York. And it's interesting because the Enquirer used to have a bulletin board up in the front hall, and they would monitor every week what the main front page stories were that you saw in the supermarket. You know, we're all familiar with that, and what the circulation was. And so they gathered the data over time of which stories sold the most papers. And it wasn't UFO stories. It was medical mysteries and celebrity scandals and some things like that. Yet the number one story in terms of quantity was UFO stories. So why did they go with that? Well, you don't even have to believe that the Enquirer was started ad hoc by an agency to know that the agencies used all sorts of journalists and periodicals, good and bad, to promulgate strategies. And so when you say tabloids, that's what comes to mind. Now, given that, knowing how disinformation does work, this is going to sound disingenuous, but the best thing you can really do is learn how to think. You have to learn how to think. And I once interviewed a profiler for the CIA, and she said what should be normal practice. She said, when you're about to come to a conclusion, when you're about to jump to a conclusion, stop yourself and ask, who am I to think that? Who am I to know that? What else don't I know? What is the data that supports what I think? And so before you leap into a conclusion because it's a compelling narrative or someone said it, remain agnostic. Remain agnostic all the way. Back up and gather the data. And if you don't have the data and know you don't have it, then don't say anything, but don't believe anything. Wait, because you don't know. And a lot of people are unhappy not knowing, in the face of the unknown especially. And Nietzsche said very fondly that we call truth those explanations which have nothing to do with the truth, but they do have everything to do with comforting us and explaining away and assuaging the cognitive dissonance people feel in the face of the unknown. So the first explanation that makes us feel better is the one we say, that's probably right, that's probably true. And then people agree on it, and pretty soon you've got orthodoxy, and you've got a consensus, and everybody knows it. And so knowing that that's what human beings do, you have to take a very self-critical attitude toward your own knowledge and way of learning and understanding, and recognize that I've been speaking professionally for 24 years, and I know that if I stay with what I know, I'm okay. But if I pretend I know something I don't know, I'm going to get in trouble. So if you know you don't know something, don't go there. And I mean that mentally as well as from a speaking platform. Don't believe it until you have some data that can help you understand what it is. Now, when you do look at the UFO data, let's get to the other side. I know it's impossible to talk to the people I've talked to over the years and look at the instances of encounters without knowing it's true. Now, the question is, what is true? Well, people have encounters with anomalous phenomena which is intelligently operated and which seems to have at least a physical or scientific or technological component, but it also behaves in strange ways that baffles us. that seems to distort space-time when we are in its presence, and we don't know what that's about. We really don't. We don't get it. So look at the data, gather the data, and if it's data that doesn't fit in your paradigm or model, hold it lightly, but don't throw it away. But be very careful with what you choose to believe. Because if it's not supported by the data, then you haven't got a leg to stand on. You haven't got a reason to believe it. And just because it's on 50 websites instead of one is no reason to believe it. Because websites copy one another.
Right. Mm-hmm.
You know? I mean,
Snowball.
Yeah. Yeah. So think about thinking. That's really the advice. Now, think about how you think.
Yeah. Now, back when you said, the people will develop something on the idea that it makes them feel good, that kind of reminds me of how a lot of religions must have developed. I don't know how you're going to take that with your background, but,
I
the
take
beliefs.
Yeah.
The belief system.
Yeah. That is correct. That is absolutely correct. Well, my background is one thing, but people assume that I have maybe because I said I was in the ministry, that I have a credulous approach to those things, and I don't. I taught English literature at the University of Illinois. I think I mentioned that.
Mm-hmm.
And I I'm sorry. My computer is playing games with me. It just locked me out of my own website. I'm going to just shut that down and go back to where we were. What was the question? I'm sorry, I got distracted.
I just basically said that a lot of the realities created by religion kind of goes along the same line of what you're talking about.
Yeah. So by studying literature, when I approached the study of scriptures, for example, you brought all that understanding of how to approach a text, a narrative, with you. You did critical thinking about the text. So take something in the Bible, you find something that was woefully contradictory, or two accounts of the same thing that were different. Instead of just explaining everything away in some fatuous way, you took a closer look at how did this come to be. And for example, you might discover there were different communities using material to tell the same kind of story in different ways, and you could tell an awful lot about the community by how it told the story. You could tell that Matthew, for example, was addressing Jewish communities, and the Apostle Paul was going to Gentile communities. The arguments they chose, it doesn't mean the arguments are literally always true. It means this is what they needed to say to make the case in a particular context. And so there was no difference in how you learned to approach religious texts than what I'm talking about with approaching narratives about UFOs. You brought a hermeneutic of suspicion to the text, and you did the analysis using all the critical acumen you had, literary tools, literary textual analysis, redaction criticism, to look at how the narrative was transferred from one generation to the next and how it changed along the way. Some of these things are obvious. We used to say the Lord's Prayer and say at the end, "For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen." Sounds great. But it was discovered that a monk, in transcribing that text, had gotten very, very excited by the Lord's Prayer and wrote in the margin his own response to it, which was, "For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen." And then the next monk, because there was no copyright or boundary around the text, next one thought, he left it out and he put it in the margin, so they included it. And then for many centuries, people said, well, these are the words of Jesus. And then you go back to the text and see where that happened and when it happened and how it happened, and you say, well, these aren't the words of Jesus. These are the words of somebody else who were put in the margin. That's just a trivial example of what it asks of us. And it's much easier to say, I believe everything. I believe everything, and that settles it. But that's not religion. that's credulous embrace of, as you say, a narrative to make you feel more comfortable with the anxiety-producing existential realities of our lives.
Yeah, that we're all going to die.
Yeah,
that's part
for
of it.
example.
Yeah. There's a question that came in on our forum from Carrie, and here it is. As President Eisenhower was leaving office, he warned about the rising power of the military-industrial complex and the threat against democracy. Do you think this is a reality in the present time? And if to do so, there are secrets known to an elite group on the UFO subject that's kept from knowledge, public presidential knowledge?
They're two different things. I mean, Eisenhower had a close-up view of what in the 50s was created. The national security state was part of it, and he was right. He was describing the military-industrial complex. He was describing a new social, economic, political reality which had come into being under his tutelage, and he foresaw that it could have some trouble.
He was right.
Now, he was right. Yeah, I mean that's what we live with now. But to go from that to is there a group managing UFOs? There would have to be. Is what you would say. How would you do it if you had any authority or responsibility for responding to this arcane exotic technology? What would you do? You would handpick the very best people and identify the means by which research, reverse engineering if possible, inference from the technological display, like for example, the plasmas that are often seen changing colors around the vehicles and ionizing the, I believe, nitrogen in the atmosphere around it, which accounts for why they change colors as the powertrain intensifies, as it accelerates. This has been described many times, and the physics of it has been done. You would start with what can we infer according to our physics now on the basis of what we see, and then what effects do they manifest, and how can we do the research that will lead us in those same directions, say to fiber optics or computer chips, if those were examples. I don't know that they were. And then you would do the research in a classified way, that is, people who worked on it would not necessarily know the intent of the research. They wouldn't necessarily know the source of the materials with which they worked. They would be given a cover story, and only those with a need to know would know, and those would be really above top secret. That's how I'd do it, and I would do it off the books. I would make sure the funding came in from unrecognizable sources to sustain the effort. And it's quite possible that such an effort would, over time, take on an identity of its own, right? People often say, well, is the president briefed on this every time they come into office? Can you imagine Trump, Bush, Obama all being told? Trump would rush to, Twitter, and he'd say, they're real. They told me it's real. UFOs are real. Wow. We'd get that, at 3 a.m. So I think if there is such a group organized around the responsible management of a response to the phenomena, it would not necessarily include any elected official of necessity. It would include those who needed to know on behalf of the project. And the project could develop a life of its own over time, depending on the motivations of the people involved.
Right. Wow. I had Chris Mellon on, who he was involved in the DOD, and he basically said that if the president requested to know information about UFOs, that they would, if they knew something, they'd have to tell him. But again, you're talking about something off the books. Need to know, it'd be a total different situation.
Well, and who would he ask? So say he asked somebody who doesn't know, or isn't part of the management group. He could very well be told in good conscience, there's nothing to it. I don't know anything about it. I don't have any data about that. And the person telling him that would tell him the truth. I mean, don't forget, when people work, people say, oh, you know about the intelligence community. No, I kind of have some hints over the years of how it operates, but no, I don't have privileged information. And the people I have talked to have sometimes told me that projects on which they worked, the ultimate reason for the project was not revealed until many years later when it was declassified, that even all the people working on the project understood it in one way. They were given a meaningful cover story, like the recovery of the Soviet sub when it went down the Pacific. The cover story was we're searching for manganese nodules in the Pacific, and created proprietaries to bring it up. Well, we were looking for manganese nodules, so if that's all someone knew, that was true. But it was also true that it wasn't the whole story. And you can't tell the whole story if you don't know the whole story, right? So it's going to be protected as much as possible. And where is the phenomena hiding? I mean, it's in plain sight. I'm a guy, who just wants to know stuff, and I know something about it. It's in plain sight. People ask me, "What is the response to your magnificent book?" And I stand there saying nothing until they get the joke. That the response is silence. That if you're not going to respond to an event that's threatening, like a true book, on the subject and how the government responded to it, just say nothing and distract people. Illusion, misdirection, distraction, and ridicule are the hallmarks of cover and deception operations. And do those well. And nobody is going to know what you know, even when you stand in the middle of the marketplace and scream at the top of your lungs. In fact, the more you scream it, the more people will think that you're crazy.
It would be interesting to know how many people have read your book, that know something about the topic.
Well, I don't know. I know some have read it. I have. Chris Mellon actually just bought copies of my short stories, Mind Games, for himself and his son, because the very first story is called 0 Day Roswell, and it discusses how people would manage an event like that. It's told by, it's fiction, and it's told by intelligence agent on his deathbed. And Chris thought that was pretty good. Now, I don't know what he did. If you look at his resume on LinkedIn, you see there's a big gap, right? About 12 years.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, it's right there for all to see. Now, someone could say, well, if he was doing something deep black, there would be a cover story that you couldn't penetrate. What is the gap? He's worked in intelligence before and after that 12-year period. I think it's 12 years. He's worked on intelligence committees, and now he is, I believe, chairing the board that Tom DeLonge has established for his entertainment and educational enterprise called To the Stars. And some of the people whose names are on the board sound pretty credible. But you mentioned, I listened to the long interviews with Chris, and I'm left saying, this is interesting. Does he really not know any more than what he knows? I mean, I was talking to somebody who knew Corso, for example, who wrote The Day After Roswell, and he knew him pretty well. And my friend was very credible, and he said he asked Corso where they might find documents about this. Because we were discussing somebody in the Navy who was likely the person who would have done what Corso said he did in the Army, that is, manage the distribution of materials to do research on that had been recovered from a crash, if such took place. And he said he asked Corso, and Corso said there are no documents. The conversations happen in out-of-the-way places. They are not recorded. I've had people on black projects tell me they convened from different parts of the country, went into an elevator and went down, and found themselves a beautiful conference room and had the discussion in the bowels of the earth about the project on which they were working, came back up, and they scattered to the winds again. And nobody talked about it with anybody else, and there are no minutes in some archive.
Wow.
There's nothing to recover. And Corso said that's the way it was when he worked on that project. Now, did he or didn't he? Was he a counterintelligence agent just spreading a story? You know, the book is flawed because there's no footnotes, there's no pointers to anything anybody can find.
Yeah.
It's just him telling a story.
Right, and there's a lot of controversy about that.
That's right,
Yeah.
and appropriately so. Mm-hmm. But you can waste a lot of time spinning your wheels on that one because there's no other data that will make your evaluation of it tilt one way or the other.
Now, when you were doing your research,
go ahead.
Pardon me. When you were doing your research for your book, how much of it was involved in getting, Freedom of Information Act, retrievals of documents?
Well, you really need to talk to Barry Greenwood about that, and you probably should. Barry wrote with Fawcett, Clear Intent, and this is one of the things we do document in the book, that after Blue Book closed down and the government had no interest anymore in UFOs, nevertheless, there were these fascinating incursions, right, over the northern tier of bases, whether it was Minot or Malmstrom or Pease or in Canada, on both sides of the line. There were a series of events that were rather striking, and using freedom of information and other means, Barry managed to document that the vehicles in question demonstrated, quote, a clear intent, unquote, hence the title of the book. FOIA was very, very important in the early days when it really worked. In other words, when it was established, people responded to it. But once Reagan came in, 1980, he did what he could to make it ineffective.
Really?
And
wow.
yeah, and you're not going to get. You can do it. There's certain areas where it can be useful, but in this area, you're not going to get much. And of course, I've had people tell me that when we don't want something retrieved through FOIA, we cross-reference the filing system so that it's in a file marked avocados and pears, and it's really about UFOs. You're not going to say, I'm searching for UFOs, and say you'll get a letter back saying we have nothing to that effect, thank you for asking. Or we'll say, yes, we found 10,000 pages, and we will be glad to duplicate them at a cost of X number of cents per page, and then deliver a treasure trove of mostly worthless paper to you if you cough up the money. So it's not as effective as it used to be, but it was in the earlier days very, very important.
I know John Greenwald has it down to a science how to inquire properly.
Yeah, and you do. You have to make it a specialization, right? To know how to get the information, and that's why the team approach was so important. I mean, there are some names that aren't on the cover of the book. We have 9 names on the cover, and there are a couple more people who didn't want their names on it for different good reasons.
Wow!
But it was a team. We met that weekend, decided what was going to be done, and we didn't meet again until the book was complete. For 5 years, everything was done over the internet. Chapters were written, chapters were disseminated, materials were discussed, editing took place, and then it was put together. I'm so proud of that book, really.
Well, that's great. I mean, just to hear that it's in so many universities is quite amazing. Early on, a question came up in the chat room, and that was, what do you think in all your research that you've done, what do you think is the most interesting or amazing case, I guess I'll say it that way, involved in the UFO topic?
What are the most important cases?
Yeah, just the person wanted to know what you thought was the most important case that you have in the book?
Well, I don't know if I'd choose the most important case. There are, there's so many critical pieces that go to make up the mosaic of the narrative. But I would say that one of the most important incidents was the 1952 overflight of Washington, D.C. in July. Mm-hmm. Because, as you probably know, so many UFOs were seen. They were seen from the ground. They were seen by pilots who were scrambled from, I believe it was 3 Air Force bases. They were seen on radar. Mm-hmm. We have a facsimile of the radar screen showing one of the jets in pursuit being surrounded by UFOs, which scared the hell out of him.
Wow.
Because he was theoretically in pursuit, and they just stopped fleeing and all closed in on him. And, he said, in effect, well, now what do I do?
Yeah.
But it was well documented. Lots of people saw it and called the Pentagon switchboard to find out what was going on. And they shut down the switchboard. And that was one of the effects that led them to believe that this thing has to be tamped down. It wasn't the only reason. There was concern about the Soviets and the Cold War, but you didn't want our communications. We didn't have redundant satellite communications interfered with in that way. And it was during that incident, because so many people saw it, it was covered. And when I do a talk on the book, I show a front page of the Washington Post. Now, the relationship of the media to the phenomena is a very interesting one to trace, because there were hundreds of front-page stories. I show half a dozen of them, but the Washington Post has a famous headline that says, "Saucer eludes jet, pilot reveals." It was news, and it remained news for some time, and it was treated as news because the people making the reports were so credible. As General Samford said, credible people have seen incredible things.
Right.
And so you watch the morphing of the news into the National Enquirer's silly stories. Space aliens drained my blood and replaced it with a viscous yellow fluid was the headline in one. And then nobody took it seriously. But for a long, long time, it was simply news. And the 52 incident is one, and they had press conferences, and some of them tried to speak honestly to the event, but they came up with an inversion as the reason for all this. And over Washington, of course, the weather reports didn't support the existence of an inversion, and so on. And so you watch a big switch then, where they decided to use celebrities like Arthur Godfrey. They would put credible people like Walter Cronkite at the fore of debunking, and then people would trust them with their narratives. Cronkite did a famous story in UFOs, an hour long, I think, and he would show something that looked really credible, and just when people got into it, he said, but this is what really happened. So he left people with the impression that there wasn't a single UFO event that could not be explained away. In fact, of course, there are many thousands of UFO events that cannot be explained away, except as encounters with anomalous beings, whether remotely or currently present in the craft. We don't know if it's robotic. We don't know if it's remote control. We don't know if they're evolved or self-defined evolution, as we are now about to do for our own species. I don't think we know the answers to these, but intelligence clearly is there. And so when you say what's most important is the cumulative evidence and data of so many people. And I have interviewed so many people, and when I do talks in the book, almost every time somebody stands up at the end of the hour and says, I've never told anybody this, but I've got to tell you what happened to me. Mm-hmm. And they often preface it by saying, I don't want you to think I was drinking, or I don't want you to think I was crazy, because it's been so effective to apply those labels to people.
Yes.
And people internalize it, and yet they talk to one another And it's kind of, I do a talk on trauma in the intelligence community and security worlds of what doing that work does to someone. And it's very similar when you talk to people who've had UFO encounters, because they have to keep it secret too often enough, not because they've signed a need-to-know agreement, but because of ridicule has been so effective. And the traumatic impact on them is the same. One of the effects is that you become obsessed. The image of Richard Dreyfuss in Close Encounters of the Third Kind building his model of Devil's Tower, while though far-fetched and cartoonish, I've talked to people who couldn't ever put it down and have spent the rest of their lives reading everything they can get their hands on to try to understand what it was that happened to them. And in that, it was like a religious experience in some ways, in that it caused a contextual shift in their understanding of everything, and not least of which was, who am I in relation to this? And who am I in relationship to the universe? And you can't go down that road without a spiritual impact taking place. And people manage spiritual impacts by seeking for religious answers. You don't necessarily need an explanation, but you go deeper into what is the meaning of all this, and who are we in relationship to the universe? And if we're not the apple of God's eye, and we're not the top of the food chain, what is this universe about? And then the ultimate mystery is, over the decades, there seems to have been a progressive revelation or display, selectively, strategically, to engineer exactly the state of mind which we have now, which is everybody knows about this now. Nobody would be shocked if someone finally owned up and we got not disclosure. We don't need disclosure. It's all disclosed out here, but confirmation of what we already know. So when you go back to the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s forward, and you say, well, why didn't they land on the White House lawn? Well, that's not the game, obviously. How do you know that? Because they didn't. Nobody landed on the White House lawn. Well, what did they do? They appeared to a few groups here and there in the night, far away, in rural areas. They didn't just buzz and hang over cities like Hollywood depicts them doing. They did it progressively, and the stories spread, and images spread, and videos spread, and photographs spread, and pretty soon, over decades, the mind of society has been altered. And Jacques Vallée plunged into that maelstrom by concluding it was a control mechanism and was more interested in the alteration than in the source of the alteration. I don't go that far, but it certainly resulted in a transformational experience on behalf of all humankind, and part of that is the knowledge that we're not alone.
Wow. Now, why do you think most science won't take a hard look at this subject? Do you think it's a ridicule factor in the loss of funds?
It's a good question, and groupthink. And just as when I'm talking about security issues that cause trauma, people say, well, I don't want to lose face in front of my peers. I don't want people to think I'm a wuss. The impact of peer pressure and groupthink is significant, especially if you know it's going to impact your career. You know, airline pilots have told me, we talk to each other about our sightings. Fighter pilots have told me that. But we're not going to say anything out loud because our careers are over. Well, it's pretty much true. Once you have an orthodoxy that's embraced by a scientific discipline or domain, you contradict it to your peril. You know the stories about meteorites and tectonic plates and so on, and what it did to people to advance those theories over time and face rejection, ridicule, and scorn. Well, once that becomes firmly placed, and for the reasons I said, began in the 50s, and have been policies that were so well executed, scientists too are not going to go into those waters without risking their careers. There are some really good books by scientists about that. Peter Sturrock, Confessions of a Late Night scientist, or A Tale of Two Sciences, in which he describes his career, which was very successful as a plasma physicist, and then his interest in UFOs and the paranormal, and how he could not get anyone engaged with that subject in a serious way, and the kind of dismissive things they would say, simply because he said, this needs to be something you take seriously.
Wow.
And that's all we're saying. We're saying this is a real phenomena. We're very conservative, right? But it's impossible to read for example, our book or other books without saying, well, there's the nose of a camel inside our tent here. I bet there's a whole camel, sticking its butt out into the dark. You can't read the accounts of why the government did what it did and how it did it without saying they're dealing with something significant and important, and hopefully concluding, I want to know more about that. Because I think it's one of the most significant realities of our time. When I start talking about technological transformation of society, I literally was told in the 80s that I was crazy. That what I said made no sense when I described what the computerization, digitalization of the world was going to do to everything from identity to intelligence work, to organizational structures, to education. In the early days, people said, you're nuts. Well, now everything that I said in the 80s and 90s was going to come. It's all here. We're living inside that. And now it's this one where I say the critical event of the 21st century is going to be not just that we know, but that we know that we are not alone, because we have engaged in an undeniable way with sentient intelligence, transgalactic, that is not us. And that is going to change everything in the same way that the computer revolution has changed everything.
Right. Now, a lot of times I have the feeling that it would just take so much to convince society as a whole, even if there was solid proof, that we are being visited. Let's just say we found out that we are being visited by extraterrestrial, and we had evidence, say,
right.
A craft or whatever it is, or a major mass sighting of something unexplainable. We've already had some like the Phoenix Lights and stuff like that. But what do you think it would take for since there is so much ridicule on the topic, and as time has gone on, what do you think it would take to convince the mass public that we are being...
Well, one of the jokes in the field is there are two kinds of people. There are skeptics and experiencers. What it takes, and we have numerous stories like this where someone didn't believe, quote unquote, as if belief was the question in UFOs, and then stood there one night and watched, as a young person described to me once, I saw what looked like 3 satellites crossing the sky, and suddenly one continued, which was obviously a satellite, and the other 2 stopped and then zipped in the other direction. And they said, my God, what was that? Well, you escalate your hypothesis. Maybe it was this, maybe it was this. But more immediately, if you have seen a bright light, a craft, some kind of luminous vehicle, and in your experience of looking at it, you had what you were sure were words put into your mind. Two of the things I've heard a lot, people say, now they may be deception on the part of whoever's on the craft, but the words were, don't be afraid, we're not going to hurt you, and they didn't. And the other was, we wanted you to see us, which supports the hypothesis I suggested about display and intentional revelation over time. Once you have that kind of experience, you don't ever doubt it again. So this is the other, of course, is like I have done. I have never had an experience. Well, I shouldn't say that. One, but I don't talk about it. But all this study of over 40 years looking at the data and interviewing people, ranging from astronauts to fighter pilots to just plain people who went for a walk in the woods one night and encountered a luminous vehicle sitting in the copse. If that doesn't change your mind, it's because you're so adamantly committed to not wanting it to be true, because it threatens your identity and your sense of who humans are, or your religious beliefs, as you suggest, or it just doesn't fit your paradigm. You don't know how to restructure your thinking to take it in. But over time, I mean, it took me a long time. I mean, I've explored this for years, and I still find myself thinking, not anymore really, but recently, so this is all true then. And that's after decades. It takes energy and effort to penetrate your model of reality, which is I'm sitting in a study made for humans, with kind of a square room, lights are on. That's my reality. And I can't walk through walls, but some people claim that they have done. What does it do to your sense of what's real? Well, it's powerful stuff we're talking about.
Absolutely. What do you think about the military, like black projects or secret projects that have advanced technology? For instance, a lot of people are suggesting that it's possible that all the black triangles that people see floating over, maybe government.
Right, are ours. Right.
Yeah.
And the answer is always given. We wouldn't test something over populated areas, and the people I know who live near research facilities say that's nonsense because they see them fly over populated areas. The Occam's razor approach to all the triangle sightings is that at least some of it reflects our technologies, right? We don't usually know for another 20 years or so what we've got. U-2 was flying for a long time. Right. Stealth bombers were flying. When I lived near Hill Air Force Base, I would see a stealth plane come in, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I remember a 747 with the space shuttle on its back landing right in front of me at Hill, and it's awesome. And I would ask people on the base, what was that? And they would say, what was what? I didn't see anything. I don't know.
Yeah. And when you were doing your research, I heard you say something about, reverse engineering, not necessarily alien crafts, but, some of the technology that we've come up with is almost hard to wrap your mind around. I heard you say something about fiber optics,
Right.
And that is one of the topics that comes up, that's possible reverse engineering.
That's right. Right. And when we talked about that, because I raised that with our group of wanting to know about that, we all admitted, as I've been suggesting all along, none of us knows enough. We don't know enough to evaluate the train of events and the materials passing on from one to another through laboratories, where we would have to what we would have to know. We can't do the scientific investigative detective work, and therefore we can't say. We can say it's interesting. Some of it is coincidental. Certainly, some of it is suggestive. But without the data, without a trail of data, to really show us that this went from this place to that person, and you watch the technology emerge over time. So often when people have suggested different things were UFO technologies, when I have talked to people who know a lot more about it than I do, physicists or chemists or material scientists, they generally have laughed and said, well, that's just not true. This is what happened. I was at Bell Labs, or I was at Northrop Grumman, or I was at Skunk Works, and This is what happened, right? So you don't know what you don't know, and those are good speculative, fun things. I write a lot of science fiction because it's the only way I can get at these things, but I don't know, and I haven't seen anybody convincingly who does.
Right. If you had to do the research today with just using the internet, you mentioned earlier that there's a lot of, repetitive websites and things like that. How would you even do that as far as this topic goes?
I know what I would do. I'd love to teach a course on it, which would be the critical thinking applied to the historical analysis of UFO data. And I would begin by going back to the 40s and 50s. If you want to do Foo Fighters, then we have a lot of material on Foo Fighters. You can do that. But go back to the first accounts. Look at, Project Sign and Project Grudge and Project Blue Book, and look at the historical accounts of how they were managed. Look at the classic texts of the work. I would include our book, but Jerry Clark has a magnificent 2-volume encyclopedia on this subject. Paul R. Hill wrote a book that wasn't published until his daughter did it after his death, called Unconventional Flying Objects. He was at NASA, and he used the best physics he knew, but they had told him, you're not to say anything in relationship to NASA. You can't claim that this is NASA. You can do what you want as a person. But this book, Unconventional Flying Objects, is very good. The Richard Hall books, the UFO Evidence, the scientific experience of UFOs by Alan Hynek as one of the foundational, Colonel Ruppelt's book on UFOs.
Yeah, I
the
heard
first
that's really
edition.
Good.
Yeah. So a lot of this is available. You start by going back to the basic text, and it's really no different than if you let's get away from religion. Let's just say literature. You want to know who wrote Shakespeare. What are Shakespeare's plays about? Well, you go back to the data. You go back to the folios. You go back to the text, and you read what the best minds have said about it, the best critical analyses of the text, and you stay away from the nonsense. And jumping from website to website to website, I look at these interviews that are up there, and I think I just can't waste another hour and a half listening to somebody say nothing as if he knows what he's talking about. It's the glory of the internet, but it's the glory of America, too. Anybody can say anything. So go back to the classic texts. There are basic texts, and if you don't have the patience or the time to take, for example, the 6 or 8 or 10 books that I mentioned, then you don't want to know. Because to study something requires that you study it. And study takes time and thoughtfulness, and above all, I said I escalated my game by engaging with much better minds than mine and much more experienced people than me. You put yourself in relationship, a mentoring relationship to the best people. I've watched hackers do this from the very beginning. Hackers had a meritocracy, and you would go online and you would do all your homework first. You wouldn't say, teach me how to hack. You would stay up all night with your O'Reilly books and read everything you could, and then if you had an intelligent question, you would ask it with respect, and you get an answer, and over time you'd be allowed to participate in the councils of the more superior, more elite hackers who knew what they were doing.
Oh, speaking of questions, pardon me for interrupting, but we do have a caller that I'd like to ask you a question, if that's all right.
Hey, Martin.
Hi. How are you? You have a question for our guest?
I do indeed. This is Ryan from South Carolina,
hey.
And thanks for taking my call. I hope I didn't come in at an inopportune time here.
No, it's all right.
Perfect time.
Yeah. I guess I had a question for you. Since the topic is UFOs and government, you had the issue I've always taken with this is I have my doubts that the government could cover this up. And follow me this. You had mentioned about them compartmentalizing it and concealing it from presidents, so on and so forth. I just have my doubts that all that would work. I was wondering if you had an idea as to how they could do that. I mean, for example, in the Manhattan Project, and it didn't get much more classified than that, Soviet intelligence penetrated the Manhattan Project.
Right.
So how is it not only that our government has managed to conceal this, but all the other governments who surely must know has managed to conceal this as well?
Well, it's a really good question. And first of all, as I say, the phenomena hides in plain sight. So when something is incontrovertibly present, as UFO phenomena has been, then what you have to do is spin multiple narratives and cast doubt on which ones are true. You know the story of the gnome. I mean, it's an old folk tale about the woodsman who went into the forest, and he knew that the gnome knew under which tree the gold was hidden, and he captured the gnome and he held him by the scruff of the neck and he said, "You got to show me what tree it is." And gnomes can't lie, so he pointed out the tree, and the woodsman took off his yellow scarf and put it around the tree, and he made the gnome promise he would not remove the scarf from the tree while he went and got a shovel. Well, he went and got a shovel. When he came back, the gnome had kept his promise. He had not removed the scarf. He had simply tied a scarf around every other tree in the forest. Okay, so that's the kind of disinformation that's very, very effective. The resources of people, as I suggested, who want to keep something secret are prodigious. The other thing is UFO phenomena has not been kept secret. Everybody knows about it. Everybody who wants to look at these stories and look at the credibility of people online, Leslie Kean and the press conference in Washington and on, you listen to these people.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I mean leaking something. I mean leaking something really concrete. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. If you'll recall, it was a Lebanese newspaper that leaked the first aspect of Iran-Contra. And nobody's debating at this point if that was accurate. It was accurate. We're still debating if MJ-12 was real. Nobody's debating if Watergate was real or not. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's just like, these leaks come, but they're kind of dead-end type leaks. You know what I'm saying? You know what I mean?
Yes, I know exactly what you're saying. And it's a very effective strategy for making sure that people don't get to the kind of certainty that you're looking for. And you're right, the Soviets could penetrate our atomic Manhattan Project, but the Soviets were no slouches. They had extraordinary resources, and they were very, very good at espionage, and they had a whole cadre of fifth columnists in this country. So it was ultimately people who were very sympathetic to the Russians, to the communists, and who were communists. You forget what it was like in the 30s here. Who ultimately penetrated. They didn't have to bribe people or blackmail people. They had willing comrades who wanted to help Russia get the bomb. I don't think we have anything like that inside the smaller arena that we're discussing. I don't think we have inside people. And when some insider, theoretically an insider, says, "I'm going to tell the truth about all this," it's isolated. A datum alone has no power to convince. If that story about Iran-Contra had only shown up in the Lebanese newspaper, it would not exist as an event. But it was only because the accumulation of evidence from other sources and the willingness and desire to make it public, because there was a political opposition that wanted to publicize it to bring down Reagan and Oliver North and so on. Only because all of those things conspired to want to bring the story forward, and the same with Watergate. Watergate was a huge event. Well, Stan Freeman calls this a cosmic Watergate.
Right.
It's kind of a stretch, but because it's a different operation and for different reasons. But we don't yet have the accumulated multiple sources who can compel the media, which is the mouthpiece of our society, except on websites, And the very fact that there are so many crazy websites makes it very, very difficult to have any idea who's telling the truth on there. And you may have a very honest, compelling story from someone, but you don't know who's tied scarves around all the trees. You don't know who's on the payroll. You don't know who just in a quid pro quo has been willing to make a video of what they said they saw in Area 51 or underground, where the tall whites and the little grays and the military are working together. It's just very, very difficult to nail it down. So I'm suggesting that the reason it can be done is because it has been done, and it's been done effectively.
All set, Ryan?
Yeah, I do. Thank you for taking my call.
You bet. All right. Talk to you later. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
So, Richard...
Wish I could give him the inside scoop, but I ain't got it, man.
Richard, you mentioned the other book that you may be working on. Can you go into a little more detail what that's going to be about?
Yeah. Different people are working on different chapters, and it is about the phenomenon itself. And it will include, for example, close encounters of this kind and the other kind. It will include physical trace cases. It will include different categories, in each of which we will present the very best cases we've got. But, it's like herding cats to get a bunch of ufologists to finish their chapters. My contribution to that book is a single chapter, which is why it is so difficult for people to take UFOs seriously. We've touched on some of that tonight. And I will explore the sociological and the psychological and political reasons why it has been so difficult for people to answer the question you asked that I responded to with Peter Sturrock's work. Why don't scientists look at this? Well, we can look at why that is. There are reasons. And paradigms change. And once the paradigm changes, everybody says, "Oh, I thought so all along," And you have to look at how those things progress. The doctor who first, at the end of it, he'd do an hour lecture, and at the end of it, he'd say, "I saw some interesting symptoms the other day," and he would describe what came to be called child abuse. And people would sit there and say nothing, and say nothing to him afterward. But he did it a few times, and somebody would come up to him in the hall and say, I had somebody in the office the other day who had those symptoms, and pretty soon the social contagion of knowledge took over, and one thing led to another, and now you ask somebody what child abuse is, everybody knows what child abuse is. But you go back and tell people 20 years ago, by the way, the Roman Catholic Church has hundreds of pedophiles who are being protected from criminal prosecution. And good Catholic would say, no.
Yeah.
Can't be.
Right.
Yeah, but it is. Yeah.
And what do you think, I'm pretty comfortable with the fact that in my lifetime I probably won't know what's going on, but do you think that we're any closer? We just got a couple minutes left here. Do you think that, I think that we're closer to accepting the fact that we're most likely not alone, but do you think we're any closer?
I think we're right there, but it's a chaotic system. I remember asking Edgar Mitchell before he died that question. What does it take? He says, Richard, it's a chaotic system, and it's seething, and the bubble can burst in any direction. I wrote a novel that came out year before last called Foam, and it's about quantum foam and the adjacency of all intelligence, and it's about an alien who's downsized so he can come to Earth and do improv. It's pretty funny, but it's a great book. Foam is listeners, is the name of it. And so what did I put in that book? I took the advice of a friend who was an assistant deputy director of NSA, who at one point when we were working on an ad hoc project said, you can't discuss any of this out loud. He stopped. He said, unless you start writing fiction. Fiction, he said, is the only way you can tell the truth. So my collection of short stories called Mind Games and my novel called Foam is loaded with truth, threaded through the narrative, because I could do it that way. And So when you ask me, do I know? I know. Yeah, I know. I know some things for sure. And then I have a whole bucket of other stories that are compelling, but I can't prove. We all do in this domain. And when is one of those going to pop in such a way that the president or the Supreme Court judge or somebody says something? Or we've had governors say it. We've had Jimmy Carter say it. We've had Reagan say it. But it doesn't penetrate until the brew is ready, until it's ready to ripen. And when it's ready to ripen, the fruit comes off the stem at a touch. But it takes a long time to ripen. And who knows? Who knows when we are suddenly going to all know and know that we know that we are part of an extraordinary universe teeming with life.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, and I believe we are. Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed it a lot.
Well, it's great to talk to you. I really appreciate your asking me to talk to you for a while, and thank you very, very, very much.
Sure thing. And people can get the book on Amazon?
The book is available on Amazon. It's also available for Kindle. The book is, I think, about $30 on Amazon. If they want one signed, I can sell it to them for the same price. $35 for hardcover, $30 for softcover.
600 pages.
One.
Yeah.
Yeah, 600 pages. It's really a bargain. The publisher, Anomalous Books, said he wanted this out here, and he did everything he could to cut the margins to the bone. So he's not making a lot of money on it.
Wow. And your website is simply your name.
ThemeWorks.
Oh, that's right. Yes, I'm
www.
sorry. That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's THIEMEWORKS.com.
Yeah, great website, too. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right, everyone. So that's... Whoop. I tried to stop that from happening. That is prematurely playing, and don't know why that happened. So our guest next week is Chase Klutsky. She's been on before. She's always a fun guest to have on. And then after that, I'm heading up to Shag Harbor and going to do a live show, and that is on Saturday on the 30th of September, and that'll be live on YouTube, live streaming on YouTube. You can also catch it as a podcast if you're a member of our show, subscriber. That'll be Saturday the 30th, and that'll be 5:30 to 7:30. Now, we're going to be interviewing direct witnesses to the Shag Harbor event. All those years ago, they're going to be there on location, and Don Ledger and Chris, who have written books on it. Should be a lot of fun. And one of the listeners said they're going to catch me there, so I'm excited about that. And if anyone else is going there, please email me at martin@podcastufo.com, and we'll be sure to meet up while we're there. All right? So thanks so much, everyone, for listening, and we'll be back next week again with Chase Klutsky at the same time. Keep your eyes to the sky.